A dirty stray dog would daily stroll along the side of a busy highway, searching for food, surviving when a bunch of motorbike riders chose to make fun of him one afternoon. They were surprised by his reaction. Unable to speak, the sun was just starting to set beyond the horizon, illuminating the sky with orange and purple hues. A stray dog with a patchwork of brown and white fur trotted over the highway's gravel-strewn shoulder. His ribs were visible through his WI frame, and he was matted with mud. But there was a resolute sparkle in his eyes, a quiet fortitude that had sustained him through innumerable days of hunger and isolation. On this particular evening, a group of leather-clad motorbike riders roared as their rumble reverberated down the roadway. They were the type of group that cruised along their engines while laughing and drowning out the crickets' chirping, that attracted attention, brash and unconcerned with their surroundings as their leader, a burly man with a thick beard and a patch on his jacket, read Talon as they slowed down close to a rest area. Talon shouted as he saw the dog stare at that mangy mute. As the others arrived with their bikes in a semicircle around him, the sound of the idling motors was amplified. Uncertain, the dog froze, pressing his ears against his skull. One of the bikers, a wiry man with a skull, laughed. What's he doing out here? Whether these humans were friends or foes. He threw a partially ruined sandwich at the dog, who gingerly smelled it before backing away, while sporting a tattoo on his neck. Picky for a stray, the dog didn't growl or bark for a few steps and wasn't even hungry. He just gazed at them, his eyes full of wonder and exhaustion. His stillness seemed to make the others laugh even more. Additionally, they started to make loud barking noises and jeer-clapping noises, even revved their motors to frighten him, but the dog refused to back down. Talon narrowed his eyes at the dog while leaning forward on his handlebars. "You have guts, don't you?" Talon asked. "Let's see how long that." Finally, he extracted a little firecracker igniting from his saddle pack. He threw it a few feet from the dog with a flick of his lighter, and the explosion caused a sharp crack to go through the air, and the dog briefly ran off with his tail between his legs. But then, an unusual thing occurred. Rather than running into the bushes like most strays would, the dog stopped and he went back to the group and waved awkwardly, as though he was trying to comprehend. The odd people, amber eyes locked with Talon's, and for a moment the smug look on the biker's face wavered. "What is he doing returning to one of the other bikers?" The dog approached them carefully, his head lowered but not in submission, and he spoke something with a tinge of uneasiness in his voice. He sniffed at the closest biker's boot with cautious trust, then glanced up at his tail and gave it a little wag. "Well, Al, yes, this mutt has more nerve than half the people I bike with in the group," Alan mumbled, shaking his head. Talon laughed, but their tone had changed from mockery to confusion. "You're not afraid of anything, are you, boy?" The dog didn't, even when he knelt down and held out a hand. There was a brief moment of connection between them as they flinched closer to sniff Talon's outstretched hand. A brief but silent recognition of our common tenacity, as one of the B-acres became agitated and wanted to continue driving, revving his engine loudly, causing the dog to back off a few paces. "We don't have time for strays, so let's roll, Talon." He straightened his face. He stared at the dog and hardened once more. "Yeah, you're right. Let's ride." As the dog stood there observing the motorcyclists' stumbling shapes as they yelled off their taunts. But he didn't loiter for a short while before turning and trotting in the direction of a group of trees nearby. His moves were deliberate, almost as though he had a destination in mind that the other riders were unaware of. He had been observing them before he was familiar with the sound of their engines and the smell of their leather jackets, learning to wait as their laughter continues to reverberate in the background. The dog vanished into the darkness, his next move fully planned. The bikers were traveling towards a remote area as they rushed down the highway, the fading light creating long shadows behind them. Location close to an abandoned petrol station, which they often used to relax after their rides. The sound of their meeting with the stray dog continued to reverberate among them, with each of them narrating the event as though it were the high point. Snake, the wiry biker with the skull tattoo I've seen, laughed about their day when mutts had more guts than brains. Talon grinned, but he couldn't stop his thoughts from wandering as larger dogs fled from us. It was unnerving how the dog had gazed at him steadily and calmly, almost comprehending. And they arrived at the petrol for reasons he couldn't fully understand, lingering like an itch he couldn't get rid of. Station was a barren place, as the first stars appeared in the night sky. They parked their motorcycles in a loose circle on the damaged asphalt, which was covered with weeds and its long drying pumps. As they sat down, they passed out drinks and lit cigarettes. "Cheers to another ride," one of them exclaimed, holding up a can of beer. The gang bursts into celebrations, their voices piercing the night's silence, but amid their rowdiness, togetherness. But they were all blind to the pair of bright amber eyes that were following them from the shadows. The dog watched the group intently from the shade of the bushes. This wasn't the first time he had followed them to this spot over the previous 2 weeks, observing the bikers as they came and went, picking up their habits, and a half-eaten burger and a discarded bone were among the items they brought. It was frequently his only food source there, but tonight the dog appeared less. The dog slinked as the motorcyclists continued their ride, more focused on something else and less interested in scavenging. He moved silently and deliberately, moving through the shadows with ease and his slender figure blending in well. His target for the night was a stack of saddlebags close to the bikes. The bags came in a variety of styles, some filled with leather and others with tools. Particularly, the jackets and spare components gave out a subtle smell that made the dog pause, a mixture of smoke and an unpleasant substance, while the snake continues to laugh at a filthy joke. Occurred to look in the direction of the bikes. His laughter paused, and he took a deep gasp. "Hey, Taloni." The others turned their heads as the leader said, "Look, that dog, it's here." As the inebriated talk subsided, they noticed the stray standing close to their bikes, his head slightly cocked. "You have to be kidding me," Talon replied, getting up and dusting off his clothes, as if he were daring them to respond. "I don't know the snake's response, but I don't appreciate the biker's low voice." They marveled as the dog sniffed at one of the saddlebags before raising his head to gaze into their eyes. Shining in the low light, he just stood his ground without running or barking. Presence of an implicit obstacle that is sufficient to cause Talon to grasp for a nearby. Before he could move, the dog grabbed the bag strap. "Rincher, I'm not dealing with this mud again." He had been eyeing it and pulling it with unexpected force, causing the bag to fall to the ground and spill its contents. A small packet wrapped in black tape rolled free among the garments and tools that were all over the place. The snake started, but Talon's remarks were interrupted as he reached for the packet and examined it. His face clouded as he turned to face the others. Talon pointedly held up the packet. The group swapped uneasily and stated, "Isn't mine?" "Looks from the previous job," another rider said, something barely audible. "Because you stated that we would hold it here," until Talon stopped talking, his gaze leaping too. The dog had been in the shadows, but the stray had vanished, retreating into the shadows with the same silence. The biker's stress increased as he walked forward with his typical arrogance, demonstrating the precision that had brought him there, replaced with a tense edge that makes you wonder if someone sent the dog to spy on us. Talon yelled, "Don't be dumb," while his tone revealed his own hesitancy. "I don't like this as a saddlebag, so I threw the packet back in there and zipped it shut. Let's load up and leave." The dog watched from his concealed perch, his keen eyes following the bikers' every move as they hurriedly packed their possessions. He could tell they were uncomfortable because of the fractures in their facade and the way their motorcycles screamed back to. For the bikers, the dog's turn and disappearance into the woods was simply another odd meeting, but this time the dog took a measured step. The bikers didn't get very far that night, but their uneasiness persisted as they got closer to something they could never have imagined. They rode to a different location, a tiny clearing close to the wood's edge that they used as a temporary hiding place. As they fell into a tense stillness, Talon paced close to his bike while the gentle rustle of foliage and the occasional hoot of an owl accompanied them. Something harsher and sharper than his usual self-assured manner replaced it. "No ordinary stray," he said to himself. Snake rolled his eyes in an attempt to release the stress, but there was something strange about it compared to everyone else. "Hey, it's just a dog. Perhaps it smelled something in the area or needed food." Bag doesn't necessarily indicate a personal grudge, but Talon wasn't persuaded after seeing how it gazed at us. That's not normal. And that bag stopped in the middle of his statement, his mouth clenched. We can't risk of this being revealed. The others looked at the packet uneasily. Their greatest weakness, which was once more skillfully concealed, was evidence of their involvement in something much more sinister than. They often revealed that the motorcyclists had made a number of enemies, and that they were being spied on by someone using a dog. Wasn't as unbelievable as it would have appeared a few days before, while the dog was moving through the woods deep inside. Pace was steady, his ears perking up at the slightest noises, and he had a specific location in mind. Previously, he walked like a shadow, his physique slack from years of survival. Through the thicket till he arrived to a tiny clearing where an ancient man stood, softly illuminated by the moonlight. A man with a friendly but wrinkled face crouched down as the dog came racing. The man whispered, "Hand over the stray's coarse fur. You're back. I'm sure you have a story to share." The dog pushed after sniffing around, the man's hand proceeded to a tiny pile of items close to a makeshift tent, eventually pulling out The man squatted next to him, holding a piece of cloth that still had the subtle smell of the saddlebag packet. The man grumbled, clutching the cloth to his nose, his brow wrinkled in a frown, and he was using narcotics. The elderly man wasn't simply a recluse, as his tone darkens, indicating that it's them once more. He was a former park ranger who lived in the woods and had spent decades studying and comprehending the area and its people. He had decided to live a more tranquil existence after retiring, but problems had a way of. This is about more than just you. It seems to have found him again. Have you been observing them, haven't you? He asked, glancing at the dog. Gently wagged his tail in mute affirmation that the elderly guy was aware of the woods and stood with slow motions, superior to everyone else. And he had witnessed enough shady activities over the years to know that these bikers were up to anything, and it wasn't a coincidence that this stray had shown interest in them. He searched through his items, taking out a tattered notebook and a tiny torch, and looking through the pages, he discovered entries regarding the riders' observations of their arrivals and departures, together with descriptions of their patterns, and even crude drawings of their motorcycles. They've been careless, he muttered primarily to himself, and this goes beyond a couple late-night trips back at the hotel if they're carrying what I believe they are. As they cleared the area, the restless snake leaned against his bike and lit a cigarette with unsteady hands. Next, Talon stated frankly, "What's the plan? We can't just sit around waiting for a dog to take us down. We get rid of it. When we notice it, we stop playing games." The others nodded, but their uncomfortable expressions revealed the dog had frightened them in ways that they couldn't escape as the motorcyclists, though they probably didn't want to acknowledge it. The dog and the elderly guy were already one step ahead of them as they discussed their next course of action. The man put his few possessions into the dog's ears pricked up and twitched as the worn bag whistled faintly. He moved in closer and suggested that we visit them to check how courageous they are without their bikes in there. The man's torch illuminated just enough of the path as they bravely and effortlessly navigated through the woods. They weren't yet going straight to the bikers' clearing. Instead, with a different strategy, the elderly man took the dog to a location where the riders could watch from a distance. The man could see the group huddled around their bikes through the thick vegetation, but the tension was. Even from a distance, he could feel how their laughing had diminished and been replaced by. The elderly man spoke more to himself. These aren't men seeking trouble, as seen by the hushed words and restless movements. Compared to the dog, these folks are fleeing from it. His gait landed on the saddlebags once more, and his keen eyes picked. Whatever was inside the one the dog had previously targeted had to be significant enough to cause these men to get anxious, and when anxious males made blunders, the dog's gentle whining caught the man's attention. He advised to be patient, scratching behind the dog's ears, and we will act when the moment is appropriate. With that, the bikers' clearing was strangely quiet as the darkness intensified their rising unease as the period of their silent resistance began. Talon continued to pace restlessly back and forth in his boots with each hour that went by. His thoughts were racing with possibilities as he crunched against the parched leaves, each one more unnerving than the last. Had started muttering to themselves that their confidence was waning in the face of an invisible danger. This is absurd. After a long period of tense quiet, Snake suddenly stated, "We're running scared from a dog and some bad luck. It's just paranoia. You don't understand that this isn't about chance." Talon gave him a sneer. The snake laughed because the stray was too intent and attentive. Before Talon could reply, the sound was hollow and harsh. "How are you losing it, man?" A low, guttural growl pierced the night, and everyone turned to face the sound, their eyes searching the. His fingers automatically went to the knife as the shadows that were encroaching on the clearing. Snake med falteringly at. "That's precisely what I mean when I say that." Talon snarled and took a torch out of his jacket. The light beam pierced the darkness as it swept across the nearby trees, swaying in the darkness as it watched us. The bikers exchanged a spooky dance with their shadows, but nothing moved. Tired looks, their initial doubts starting to fade. What if it's not just one of the younger riders named? Axel whispered, his voice quivering a little, showing signs of nervousness. "What did? Someone sent it." And Talon's jaw tightened as he gripped the torch more tightly. "It doesn't matter. We'll deal with the dog." And the old man and the stray dog observed the action from their vantage points, but whomever is behind it will not survive. From a concealed position, the man had observed the bikers' growing restlessness, their confidence ebbing with every sound, and fear was a potent instrument, and Shadow couldn't help but feel a pang of satisfaction. "You did a wonderful job using the one he had mastered over decades of dealing with poachers and criminals in the bush," he muttered to the dog, who was sitting attentively by his side, rattling them. The dog's ears perked up in response, and his eyes were focused on. The man carefully positioned himself in the clearing below to be unseen, and his keen eyes spotted. He whispered, "Now we just need to," as he noticed the motorcyclist's apprehensive shifting and the glimmer of a torch beam. Pushing a little harder, he reached into his rucksack and took out a little handheld device that he had used as a wildlife emitter. It could simulate the cause of a variety of creatures, including coyotes and wolves, throughout his years as a ranger. Tonight, it would serve, with a few modifications. The gadget's low, frightening growl reverberated throughout the bikers froze, whipping their heads in the direction of Talon's. His hold faltered, and the flashlight's beam trembled. What the devil was that? Snake attempted to shrug it off with Axel's barely audible murmur, but the strange sound was likely caused by a coyote, which is a common occurrence locally. When a second roar came closer, the bikers automatically drew together, regaining their prior self-assurance. The old guy muttered to the dog, "Time for phase 2, and he clicked as the bikers' panic subsided and their paranoia increased. The gadget once more made the sound of a twig snapping beneath the foot, but this time it came from the opposite direction. The bikers whirled in the direction of the growl, giving the impression that something or someone was circling the area. Around their eyes, the snake drew his dagger and darted towards the source of the disturbance. Talon's palm trembled a little, but this isn't amusing anymore. If you're out there, show yourself. Shut up, Snake, whomever it is, they're playing with us, and we're not providing them the opportunity to vent his displeasure. I'm not here to find out." But Axel abruptly ran towards his bike because the strain was too much for him. "Isn't worth it, Axel. Return here," Talon yelled, but the younger, with his tail light rapidly fading into the distance, the motorcyclist roared his engine and drove out into the darkness. Talon swore under his breath as the other bikers stood in stunned silence, their group dynamic now shattered. Kicking a rock out of frustration is fantastic, but now we have a coward on our. With a calculating smirk, the elderly guy observed Axel's escape. "Let's see how long the others can survive back in the clearing," Talon said, scratching the dog behind the ears. Regain control of the situation by listening. He snarled in a low voice, demanding that we be together. Running away like terrified children, we deal with whatever comes up. Even though their fear was evident and the mood in the area had changed, the remaining bikers hesitantly nodded. The dog's quiet whining, which drew the old man's attention, replaced the friendship they had once had with mistrust and anxiety. He focused on the saddlebags, where the faint trace of the contraband was still visible, and followed the dog's gaze. The old guy responded, "Smart papa," with a note of appreciation in his voice. "You haven't forgotten about that, have you?" He was already planning the next move the bikers would make as he returned to the shadows. It wouldn't take much more to push them apart as their unity broke down under the pressure of fear and suspicion. Over the edge, and as the night became darker and the bikers' clearing expanded, he and the dog would be prepared when the time came. Talon was even more stiff as he walked back and forth like an animal in a cage, with every step a vicious snake. While the rest sat around the dying embers of his bike, he leaned against it and muttered grumblings. The suffocating blackness of the forest, their faces lit by the flickering orange glow of their bonfire. To shut in its shadows alive with nighttime noises, a howl sounded in the distance. The sound was low and eerie, sending a chill down a snake's spine through the silence. Even if he made an effort to conceal it with a rough laugh. This is becoming absurd. We're jumping at every sound. A dumb dog. It's more than just a dog. Talon yelled so loudly that you could see what it. He was so frightened by what happened to Axel that he fled with his tail between his legs. A strange snake roll. We don't have to wait here for whatever it is you believe it to be, because Axel is a child and couldn't withstand the heat. Before Talon could respond, they were drawn to the edge of the clearing by the sound of rustling leaves. For a wild moment, nothing moved as torch flames swept through the thick underbrush, but then a shadow darted just. A swift silent blur that vanished as fast as it appeared outside the reach of the light. Had shone there. Did you see how one of the motorbike riders trembled and whispered? Talon didn't respond. He was already approaching the location when the beam from his torch, which he held steady, showed. Simply trees and tangled foliage. Yet his stomach began to churn. What are? You're doing it, man. The snake called after him, but Talon ignored him and continued into the forest. Trees appeared to enclose him, their twisted branches creating a canopy that hid his heart from the moonlight. For the first time in years, he felt the pounding as he looked around the dark for the source of the movement. From his disguised vantage point, he initially unable to recognize genuine terror. The elderly man mumbled impatiently as he observed Talon's reckless advance. That'll be. The dog by his side whined faintly as he undid it, its ears perking up at the slight. When the elderly man heard movement, he followed the dog's eyes and noticed a snake that had grudgingly left the clearing to follow. Talon pinched at his lips with a grim grimace, and then another one appeared. He adjusted. The sounds appeared to come from the sound emitter he was holding, which he adjusted to a succession of low, guttural growls. The tree's reflections off the trunks gave the impression that a pack snake was coming and stopped in his tracks. As the torch beam shook as it moved through the trees, Talon growled, losing his confidence. We have company. Talon turned to give him a fierce look, his jaw clenched, and the growls intensified. Louder, closer. Talon's self-assurance wavered for a moment before he took off, but he stayed close. Commanded in a quiet voice, if something is out there, we face it together. The other riders regrouped back at the clearing. Their patients were wearing flimsy clothes, and one of them, a wiry man named Buck, stood closer to the fire, his nerves fraying. Suddenly throwing dirt onto the embers. I'm out. Another biker heavier. And I'm not sitting here waiting to be picked off. He gave him a terrified face, clearly scared and set. You can't just walk away. What if something out there follows you? He grabbed his helmet while Buck stared at him, saying, I'd rather take my chances out there than sit here like a sitting duck. Began to head for his bike, but before he could get there, a low bark reverberated over the clearing, and Buck's eyes widened. As he looked around the shadows, he heard the bark get louder once again, followed by the sound of twigs breaking, and suddenly out of the stray dog appeared in the shadows, its golden eyes shining in the fur light. The motorcyclist gazed at it as it stood at the edge of the clearing, its body low to the ground, its muscles twitching like a coiled spring. Its piercing gaze caused their confidence to crumble. Instead of growling or bare its fangs, it merely observed them. What is it doing to the heavier cyclist that makes its presence unnervingly calm? Buck stumbled and backed up, saying, I don't know, but I'm not sticking around, to discover that the dog had scuttled him as he turned to mount his bike. Off with incredible speed, its body obstructing the way like a mute warning between him and his escape. Good boy, the elderly guy whispered, chuckling quietly, amazed by the dog's intuition. Keep them guessing. He could see the group's fear of the unknown becoming a source of panic. There was a noticeable sense of tension as they were disintegrating, their unity breaking beneath the strain. Now for the last push, he continued, taking a small flare from his pack and striking it, causing the crimson flame to ignite, and threw it into the clearing, where the motorcycles leaped as the flare's intense light continued to flicker. The dog took advantage of the brief distraction provided by the shadows cast by the trees to withdraw back into the shadows and leave the gathering. Buck was the first to lose it when confronted with the disturbing scene alone. "So I'm leaving." As he revved his bike and rushed out of the clearing, he pushed past the others, his panic contagious. The remaining motorcyclists' brittle confidence was shattered by the old man watching Buck's, and their departure left them even more shaken. He murmured, retrenched with satisfaction, "Another one down. Let's see how long." The other bikers held out, frozen in place, as the sound of Buck's motorbike receded into the distance. Between their bluster and an increasing sense of dread, Snake went back to the clearing, bringing Talon along. Scenes shook, and their previous swagger was replaced by a gloomy resolve. "What the hell is going on here?" the Snake snarled. "There's something more out there than a dog," and his voice broke the uncomfortable silence. Talon gave him a piercing. "It's only your idea, because Buck fled because he was weak and is now attempting to reclaim control of the situation. Your head, Snake, is pointing towards the edge of the clearing where the flare is still burning, and you're allowing the spot to screw with it." Brightly, "I didn't imagine that someone was playing with that. We went out for a quick score, but I didn't sign up for this dude." And Jesse, one of the younger riders, ultimately broke down. Talon's jaw tensed, and he could sense the gathering drifting away, their dread eroding. Not some horror film in the woods. His power, he looked about with keen eyes, looking for anything that could help him gain an advantage, yet no one was going. "We're sticking together and riding this out," he added in a low, threatening voice. "You have no idea what it is, but we'll face it like a crew." Snake snorting and crossing his arms. "Perhaps it's not just the dog. There could be a crazy person out there tricking us, and we'll find them," Talon said. "You want to go out there by yourself and be my guest?" as he stepped closer to the Snake. His voice was brimming with menace. The old man saw the group disintegrate and could tell that if you run, you're on your own. Talon and Snake were at odds, and their leadership dynamic was changing out of fear that it wouldn't. It took a lot to drive them over the edge, and the puppy next to him whimpered softly, its golden eyes staring at the elderly motorcyclists. A guy placed a steady, comforting palm on its head, and the child allowed them demolish themselves first. He took out another gadget from his kit that was set up to generate a high-pitched whistle that was hardly perceptible to humans. Yet the dog instantly became alert and recognized its function. The dog purposefully circled the bikers just outside the clearing while the elderly guy turned on the device. Its swift and deliberate movements were intended to confuse and further unnerve them. Jesse was the first to respond, turning in circles while attempting to follow the dog's motions while it watched us. He yelled, his voice laced with, "Why is it merely watching us?" Shut up, while Talon barked in panic. Even he went to Snake for a weapon as his calm began to waver. "We're going to end this now," but Snake hesitated, looking the direction of the clearing's edge, where the dog had vanished. "But what if there were more? You want to stay here and wait to hear?" that Talon shot back. "We're predators, not snakes. It's time to pretend to be it." But before the Snake could respond, the dog resurfaced, shocking the group by appearing now standing firmly and unwaveringly in the middle of the clearing. Its golden eyes were fixed on Talon, challenging him to make the Jesse whispered, creeping closer to the Snake. "First move. What are you waiting for?" Talon clenched his teeth and moved forward, keeping his torch beam focused on He snarled it was time to teach this mumble lesson, but as he played enough games, he lifted his arm, and the dog gave a deep, guttural growl that stopped him cold. It wasn't a loud growl, but it held an unusual burden that echoed across the clearing like a warning serpent that was unable to control his. Talon's arm was seized by panic. "Don't you think that something is wrong?" Tal, a typical dog, jerked his arm free because he was too proud to back down. "It's only a..." Despite the lack of conviction in his voice, he asserted that nothing more was. The dog moved closer, intensifying its roar, and its golden eyes appeared to challenge Talon's authority in a sense. For the first time in his life, Talon paused, his confidence wavering. The elderly guy observed with silent contentment as his palm rested on the surface of the. With the help of the whistle device's control panel, the dog moved precisely, manipulating each growl and step. The biker's feelings of fear, uncertainty, and rage were all planned out, and they are near. He muttered to himself a little more as he changed the gadget and turned on a distant secondary frequency. The bikers swung around their spotlights as another, louder, and more terrifying howl reverberated through the trees. There's more of Jesse running around in the dark, whispering, his voice shaking. "Oh God, there's more of." Talon felt the group's unity eroding further as he clenched his fists, his knuckles white, disintegrating with each second that went by. He had to take action to restore control, but when he turned to face the dog again, he discovered it standing even closer and growling. His voice was barely audible as he walked back, rumbling like a distant thunder snake. "Whatever is going on, Talon, it's bigger than us, and we have no control over it." His gaze flitted between the dog and, for the first time, he realized that Snake might be correct as his crew's mind raced. They were prey now, not predators. The deafening silence of the jungle was broken by the sound of another howl in the distance, this one more intense and resonant, as though the night itself was. The bikers instinctively gathered together while they were still alive, their previous arrogance eroding beneath their feet like parched leaves. Talon's torch flickered as he looked about at the trees, his hand gripping the handle more tightly. "What's the scheme now?" the fearless commander snarled in a sarcastic and terrified voice. Talon chose to ignore him and concentrate on the dog that was still standing in the clearing, its golden eyes never leaving it. Appeared to glow dimly, as though reflecting an odd light. This was the first time Talon. The old guy adjusted his whistle, as he felt doubt sneaking into his mind from the forest edge. As the device increased the intensity once more, a second dog appeared in the shadows in its sleek form, like a ghost slicing across the night. This one was bigger, its foray. The moonlight seemed to be absorbed by the stark black, which came to a halt immediately behind the golden-eyed dog, its snarl harmonizing. The bikers shrank back with its comrades, a mixture of shock and fear growing. Between the two of them, Jesse now stumbled while clutching Snake's arm. "This isn't natural, get it?" Grasped Talon growled, but his tone conveyed his uneasiness. "There are only two dogs. Can we?" Snake shot back his anxiously darting eyes. "We can handle this. Still believe that this is merely a chance incident. Take a look at them, Talon. They're at work." The elderly man grinned as he turned on a different frequency on the gadget, as if they were organizing something. Although the sound was inaudible to humans, the dogs reacted right away. The golden-eyed dog gave a piercing bark, and the black-furred one vanished back into the shadows, moving so smoothly that it looked to blend into the trees. The golden-eyed dog maintained its steady look as the bikers halted, uncertain whether to interpret the bark as a warning or a threat. Fixed on a Talon as though he were being challenged to approach. "What is Jesse doing?" "It's testing us, Snake," he said in a scarcely audible whisper, his countenance murmured. "Grim is attempting to gauge our response." "When did you become an expert on dogs?" Talon exploded with rage. Yet even as he did so, he discovered. The tension reached a boiling pitch when he couldn't take his eyes off the dog's piercing stares and heard a rustling sound. The motorcycles behind them whirled around, headlamps flashing through the trees, emerging from the underbrush, but instead of, their light only illuminated the dark thicket shadows, dancing like mocking specters, as they sought the source of the commotion. Snake retreated a step, his confidence fading as we were encircled. Panic creeping into his voice, he murmured, "There are more than just two dogs." Talon wanted to reject them out there, so he clenched his teeth and whitened his knuckles around the torch handle. Snake dismissed his crew's worries as unfounded, but he felt in his heart that something intentional, something premeditated, was observing them out there. Until the clearing, a low growl rumbled from the trees, this time coming from a different direction, then another, and another, was encircled by an imperceptible wall of sound, and the bikers pressed close together, their bluster giving way to Jesse's unadulterated fear. He broke the silence with a strained voice, saying, "We must leave, but we're not going." Even though his confidence was waning, Talon snarled until we understood what was happening. "Serpent, what's happening is that we're being hunted, Talon, and you're too stubborn to admit it the old way," he said sharply. Fear was a powerful tool, and the man used it to his advantage as he watched with glee as the motorcyclists started turning on one another. He pressed a button on the whistle device, bringing the black dog back into the clearing like a skilled craftsman. This time, instead of growling, it just stood next to its buddy, its presence being enough to increase the biker's discomfort. The black dog approached the edge of the clearing as though indicating a particular spot, and the golden-eyed dog barked once again. Notice that the bikers were uncertain on whether to ignore or obey the cue, but the golden-eyed dog stayed motionless, its eyes unblinking. "What is it doing now, Jesse?" He trembled as he murmured, attempting to guide us to a snake estimate or possibly. Talon hesitated, caught between his natural inclination to act and the increasing. He finally realized that he might be in over his head, and he made a decision that was fine. Despite his trepidation, he stated in a firm voice, "We follow the dog, but we stay together." And when the motorcyclist grudgingly followed the black dog, the golden-eyed one followed, and we kept our rifles ready. The forest appeared to enclose them, serving as an implicit warning not to leave the group. With every step, the darkness grew deeper, and every sound, a rustling leaf, a shattering twig, heightened their anxiety. The elderly man, who knew the forest and was stretched to the limit, followed from a distance while holding his whistle gadget, superior to everyone else, and he led the dogs precisely as he led the motorcyclists more into the trap he had constructed. He whispered, "I'm almost ready," in a steady, low voice. A bit farther away, the black dog came to a sudden stop when the gang staggered into another area that was dominated by a huge gnarled tree. The dog with the golden eyes circled the group, turning to face them with an almost expectant attitude. Snarl, a continual reminder of their PR-addled predicament, and what the snake now required. Before Talon could react, a new sound filled the air as his voice broke. The riders paused when they heard a deep, resonant bark that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Their panic was at its height since this was no typical dog. Rather, it was something completely different, and the clearing was abnormally. The golden-eyed dog sat as they searched the dark surrounds. The biker's breathing remained loud and irregular. Down, its eyes never leaving them, as the black hound stalked the clearing's edge, each stride purposeful and the gigantic tree's twisted limbs, which loomed like the skeletal fingers of a long-dead giant, were measured above. Talon tightened his hold on his torch and clenched his jaw, saying, "We're not playing your game," whispered to himself as though speaking to the dogs. But in spite of his defiance efforts, he could not get rid of the impression that the dogs were in charge and that they were anticipating something in the shadows. The elderly guy shifted into a crouch behind a tree's massive trunk, his keen eyes. When the camera shifted between the motorcycles and the dogs, the golden-eyed one had done a good job of capturing the intruders like in. The black dog circling was not a haphazard act. Rather, it was a test of limits to keep the riders within the. The old man raised the whistling gadget and murmured, "Let's see how bold you are now," the area where the trap would unfold. He was about to speak when the forest let out another deep bark that shook the area like a rolling wave. The sound seemed to be louder, more authoritative, and exuded a sense of power that chilled the biker's spine. The leaves tremble as the ripples move through the air, and the riders naturally snuggle closer together. With shaking hands, Jesse murmured to Talon, "We must leave immediately," but before Talon could respond, the golden-eyed dog stood and moved forward. It was a small, almost inconspicuous movement, yet it caused quiet. Jesse noticed right away that the dog's expression was composed yet frighteningly perceptive. "What is this thing, Snake?" he whispered, his eyes locking into Talon with such intensity that he was frozen in place. Talon hissed, but his words lacked conviction. "Cracking, it's just a dog. Does that look like any stray you've ever seen trying to frighten us?" Jesse counted, his voice rising in alarm. The black dog ceased pacing as the tension between the motorcyclists increased and gave a low, guttural snarl. Beyond the clearing, other forms started to appear from the shadows. They were silent and fluid and methodical. A pack of canines emerged one by one, each one distinct in size and color, but they were all moving with the same uncanny accuracy, and as they formed a loose perimeter, their eyes glinted in the low light. As Talon's torch beam shook and shattered around the bikers, he swept it across the group. At least 8 dogs were acting more like people than animals, and their presence was both menacing and coordinated. "We're surrounded by soldiers acting like soldiers," and Jesse cried as he retreated towards the serpent, "which we can't escape." As he observed the pack assuming their positions, the elderly man grinned grimly. He strained for the moment he had been anticipating, the result of years of training his faithful friends. The golden-eyed dog growled forcefully when another button on the whistling device was pressed, its signal piercing the uncomfortable. When the golden-eyed dog barked, the bikers Flynn Ed became silent. But what came next frightened the pack even more. Their voices blended into a cacophony of screams and barks as they all reacted in unison, echoing through the. There was no space left after the sound was cleared. It was a warning and a message. "I'm not sure." But Talon's fear was now mixed with wrath as he tightened his fists. He grabbed the pocket knife he always carried and flicked it, saying, "Who's behind this? But we're not going down without a fight." With a harsh click, it opened, and the black dog growled harder before lowering its body into A. The pack adopted a posture that exuded threat, its growls coordinating like an orchestra getting ready for A. "Talon, doesn't Snake," warned him in the climactic finish, and his eyes widened in terror. "Is not something we can combat." We can observe that Talon suddenly moved forward while brandishing a knife, but before he could approach the dogs any closer, the golden-eyed one gave a single, sharp bark that sounded like a command, and the result was instantaneous. The pack charged forward without attacking, but they halted just shy of the bikers' vicinity in a deliberate show of superiority, driving the gang into A. Talon automatically raised his knife in the tighter cluster, but he hesitated because of the golden-eyed dog's unwavering look. The terror that held him in place was something more profound, something primordial. Jesse's voice was hardly audible as he fumbled, indicating that dogs are not normal. Snake's panic turned to near hysteria as the elderly man entered the clearing, his silhouette framed by the. His hands were gently at his sides. The dogs were divided, and the whistling gadget hung around his neck in the moonlight. Approached, their growls fading as they showed their master a great deal of respect. The elderly man replied in a calm, low voice that you believed you could make fun of the motorcyclists and get away with it. Talon dropped his knife a little as they gazed at him in startled stillness, their fear now mingled with perplexity. The old man's voice trembled as he shouted, "Who the hell are you?" He ignored the question, focusing instead on the. As he spoke, he crouched next to the golden-eyed dog and scratched behind its ears. "This person, who is wiser than you all put together, saw through your harshness and brought you here for a reason. What do you want from us?" gasped the elderly guy, who stood slowly, his eyes hardening. The word justice hung in the air, piercing the terrified bikers. The motorcyclists couldn't help but feel as though the elderly man's tone was authoritative and that his thoughts were like a sword. Though his knuckles were white, Talon's grip tightened on his knife when he saw children engaged in some serious transgression. Justice spat in a tense manner, infusing his voice with swagger. "You can't just." The old man stepped forward purposefully, and the golden-eyed dog remained. He said, "Sick a pack of strays on us and call it justice." Near him, he added in a calm tone, "Justice isn't about vengeance, boy. You've tipped that balance too far tonight, firm. It's all about balance." The pack's silent presence and formed ranks behind the bikes forced the group to stay still. He is pacing wildly, breathing quickly and irregularly. Yet this isn't happening. Jesse trembled and murmured back, "This can't be real." But it is, and we must pay attention because we have no other option. Hear Talon snarl as his annoyance erupts. "We can't be touched by this old man and his mangy dogs, especially the black dog." Talon flinching in spite of himself, the old man gave a slight smile that was devoid of humor as he let out a deep guttural sound. "Do you believe that you are the predator in this tale, but you are not the elderly man who was reached into?" He took a faded picture out of his pocket and held it up so the motorcyclist could see a image of a young child with a bright smile standing next to the dog with the golden eyes. The boy's arm wrapped around the old man's voice was heavy as he started talking about the dog's neck and their evident bond. Alex is more than a stray when it comes to emotion, and he has been my friend, and when he was a puppy, guardian in my family, and that night by the highway, he wasn't searching for scraps. Instead, he was looking. The motorcyclists exchanged uncomfortable, casual looks with you, their confidence eroding as a result of the elderly man's remarks. Alex observed what you did. The elderly man persisted in tightening his tone and making fun of. It's funny how you laugh like his life didn't matter, but Alex isn't like you. Didn't react hatefully. Instead, he did so with intention. Talon shook his head, his defiance wavering. This is crazy. The elderly guy repeated, his eyes narrowing. Just a dog, just a dog. Let me tell you what. He pointed to the group around them, saying, just a dog can do. Each of these dogs has a backstory of being abused or abandoned, forgotten, and each one of them came to me. Together, we've created something you can't comprehend. Alexa moved forward, his eyes meeting with the golden-eyed dogs of the family EY pack. For the first time, Talon noticed something in the dog's eyes that chilled his blood and affected his ability to make intelligent decisions. Additionally, a silent inquiry that I don't care about. What will you do now? Talon interrupted your story, but his voice wavered. We'll leave here, and nothing you or your dogs can do. The elderly man groaned with a look of sincere disappointment crossing his. You still don't understand, face. What does it even mean that you won't leave until you put things right? The old guy cocked his head slightly, as though the serpent had demanded his speech. Taking the question into consideration entails accepting accountability for Alex on behalf of the others. Additionally, it appeared to you that the old man's words were bearing down on the bikers, making the clearing appear darker. After a few moments of silence, Jesse eventually said that he murmured, we need to fix this, Talon. Shut up. Talon barked and turned. Jesse shot back his voice as he glared at him. You're just scared. Yeah, I am. Rising, but that doesn't mean I'm mistaken. Look at us. We're outnumbered and cornered. And we're in the wrong. Snake nodded grudgingly, his pride finally giving way to dread. Perhaps Talon has a point. Talon's defiance faltered as he gazed about at the pack and relaxed his hold on the knife. It's time to stop fighting. Their eyes following his every step. He glanced at the elderly man who was patiently waiting before turning to face Alex. Talon dropped the knife fine, he muttered, mocking the hound that had brought him here with a roar of frustration. The old man's posture remained stiff, but his visage softened significantly. What do you want from us? First, an apology. Talon, acknowledge your actions and mean them to Alex, the pack, and yourself. Laughed, but Jesse moved forward and murmured, I'm sorry, in a shaky voice. Didn't intend for things to get this far. The snake followed his voice, which was hardly audible beyond a whisper. I was mistaken, and everyone looked at me. Looked to Talon, who paused before mumbling, I apologize, old man. Nodded, his face unreadable, which is a beginning, but words are meaningless. Deeds are what count. Talon asked, what kind of actions do you see? And the elderly guy said, Alex sent you here for a reason. So now is the time to see if you can actually make a difference. The mood stayed somber as the old man's comments lingered in the air as the bikers stood around by the motionless, vigilant pack, wanting more than just. Talon's hands clenched in a fist as he whispered an apology, his pride fighting the fear that seeped deeper into his. Jesse and the bone snake looked at one another uneasily, their faces revealing the shame was now weighing heavily on them. So Talon finally asked, his voice gruff, you've apologized? Isn't it enough? The elderly guy cocked his head and stared at him relentlessly. An apology is a fine place to start, but you also need to acknowledge the hurt you've caused and take action to make amends. Make it the way you want us to join your small group, Talon sneered. Jesse, clearly terrified, began barking at the moon and moved forward before the elderly man could react. Talon, stop it. Talon opened. Just take a moment to think about someone besides yourself. He opened his lips to respond, but Jesse interrupted him. Do you not see it? Do you? They didn't ask to be abandoned, harmed, were treated like trash, and they didn't select this life. Yet here they are working. Serpent reluctantly nodded, his voice piercing the silence. Jointly surviving because someone cared enough to give them a chance. Yes, silence. And perhaps that's what we need as well. A chance to make things right. Every creature deserves a second chance, but it must be given. The old man observed them intently, his eyes softened but still piercing. Be earned. Alex wouldn't have brought you here if he didn't think you were worth saving. As though sensing his name, Alex moved forward, silently commanding Talon's attention with his golden eyes. The two gazed at one another for a while, before Talon had an unexpected recollection of a dog stir within of him. He had a dog as a boy that he loved, but when his family relocated and left it behind, it was abandoned. I didn't mean any of it, Talon mumbled, his voice barely audible, and the elderly man nodded slowly. Damage, whether deliberate or not, but if you're prepared to accept accountability. There is yet hope, because Jesse got closer to the elderly man and his determination grew. Do we have to follow me? The elderly guy asked in a calm, yet strong tone before turning, and started to walk the pack, letting him pass through. Alex remained by his side, gently swishing his tail as though. Talon hesitated, his pride still struggling with his conscience. Serpent. But he trusted the bikers to follow. Pushed him. Come on, guy, what's the other option? We're not going to have a run fight. Talon grudgingly moved forward out of this without complying with his request, and another Jesse and Snake followed. The pack proceeded silently and attentively alongside them, their expressions a mix of interest and trepidation. The elderly guy led them farther into the forest under the moonlight, serving as an implicit warning of the repercussions of going back. They reached a clearing with a modest rustic shelter standing there, filtered through the trees and silvery beams. Was straightforward yet robust, with enclosed sections and temporary kennels all around. This could be heard inside among the curious barks and gentle whimpers of other pets. The elderly guy pointed to the sanctuary, saying, I've taken dogs who have nowhere else to go. Jesse's eyes swept across the space where they heal and discover that not all people are evil. His sense of guilt grew as he observed the evidence of kindness and caring that stood in sharp contrast to their own. Behavior. Snake shifted uneasily, his shoulders hunched, and Talon appeared to. His confidence was tempered by the scene in front of him. What do you want us to do here, Snake? The elderly man carefully inquired. His tone did not change, but his countenance did. You're going to help every dog here that needs something to eat. Talon, you will learn what it means to take care of another life by providing comfort through water exercise. The elderly man shook his head, saying, You're making us into kennel boys. So this is some sort of punishment. Here, it's a lesson rather than a punishment. If you can't feel sympathy for these creatures, then there's no hope for you. But if you are able, perhaps you are more complex than I initially thought. Highway. Jesse moved on, saying steadily, I'll do whatever it takes. I'm sick of feeling like the evil guy. He nodded, and I'm growing stronger too. Man. Everyone's eyes shifted to Talon, who stood motionless under the weight of expectations weighing heavily on him. He sighed deeply and muttered, Okay, I'll assistance, but don't count on my approval. The elderly man nodded in agreement. He gave each of them a task feeding, saying, You just have to do it, you have to like it. The dog's initial motions while cleaning the kennels and making fresh bedding were awkward, apprehensive, and reluctant, but as the evening went on, something started to shift. The previously cautious dogs began to come closer, and their trust grew with. To their own astonishment, the bikers started to soften Jesse with each friendly act. He smirked as he saw a playful puppy tug at his sleeve. Snake when he knelt down to pet an older dog, replaced by a sincere smile, and even Talon, despite his reluctance, felt an odd warmth. By the time the first rays of light appeared, Alex's golden eyes were full of understanding as he leaned against him. Woods, the riders were worn out but changed, and the elderly man stood observing. You've taken the first step, he added with a look of quiet pride in his eyes, but the road to redemption is lengthy. Will you continue to travel it? Talon looked at his companions. Alex felt a spark of optimism for the first time in a long time when he had thought he had lost it. The truth of the biker's predicament hid in as the sun rose higher, bathing the sanctuary in warm light. Had formerly made fun of the chores, but now it spent the night helping the elderly man take care of the dogs. Physically taxing and emotionally taxing, but now they had to consider if this was really sufficient to make. At the edge of the clearing, resting on the wooden fence, the elderly guy made apologies while keeping his eyes on the motorbike riders, who sat on the ground with happy, exhausted dogs. Alex, always faithful, reclined at Talon's feet, his golden eyes silently observing him with confidence. "You've done a good job," the elderly man said, voice that carries both challenge and approval. "But one night of work doesn't negate all you've accomplished. What comes next is the question." Jesse spoke out first, his voice steady, although with a hint of doubt. "I'm not sure, but I simply don't want to return to the... It no longer feels right the way things were harming people and creating problems." Snake nodded in agreement, displaying a startling softness in place of his typical arrogance. The old man's eyes softened, and he nodded slowly. "I don't want to be that guy anymore. But how do we even begin to move on? It takes time, work, and dedication to start over. But the fact that you're asking that question, which indicates that you have hope." But Talon said nothing, his face unreadable. His hands were on his knees, and he appeared to be idly stroking behind Alex's ears. He was lost in thought, struggling with feelings he couldn't quite put into words, and at last Talon looked up at the elderly man and questioned, in a hushed but doubtful voice, "What if we're not cut out for this? What if we make a mistake again?" The elderly man gave a small smile, "And you got back up. And try again." Redemption is about choosing to be better every day, not about being flawless. The brief silence was broken by Alex's gentle growl as he pushed Talon's hand. Talon's nose and tail were wagging slightly, as though he was being prodded forward. He mumbled, "This dog," with a faint smile beginning to appear on his face. The old man's demeanor became serious. "And he's too nice for us. Dogs sense the best in us even. Perhaps it's time to begin living up to what Alex perceives in you, even if we can't see it in ourselves." For the first time, Talon, Jesse, and Snake seemed to be affected by those words. Weren't merely fleeing their past. They were thinking about a potential future. "I'll stay," Jesse answered. His voice abruptly became forceful, and he motioned. "If you'll have me, I want to keep helping. I want to learn from you from them." Snake paused, looking at Talon before moving towards the dogs that were now resting calmly around the clearing. Nodding, "I agree. I'm sick of living as though I had nothing to lose. Perhaps it's time." Talon was the last to speak, his voice firm but low. "I don't know if I can find something worth holding on to." He acknowledged change, "But I'm prepared to give it a shot." The elderly man studied them extensively. He held out his hand to each of them for a time before nodding, saying, "Trying is enough for now." Them, and after shaking it, they came to a silent understanding that this was their opportunity to reconstruct their lives and not only make amends. It wouldn't be simple, but for the next few hours, they had a goal for the first time in years. Went by in a flurry of activity as the bikers carried on helping the elderly guy with his morning duties They cleaned the kennels, fed the dogs, and even fixed a portion of the fence that had been destroyed during Even though each duty was minor, it felt like a big step towards redemption. At noon, the elderly guy summoned them together once more while holding a little wooden box in his hands. "Before you leave," he continued thoughtfully, "I want to give you something." He opened the box to display a collection of these personalized tags, each engraved with a dog's name, are for the dogs you've assisted today, by explaining that they save their experiences, their suffering, and their fortitude as a reminder of. Jesse and Snake gratefully received their tags in light of everything you've learned here and the lives you've impacted. Looked serious, and when Talon's time came, he paused, his eyes lingering. Alex looked up at the elderly man with the tag on him, his voice full with emotion. "What about him?" The old man grinned when Talon inquired if he needed a new home. "Alex has a home here," and his eyes are sparkling with comprehension. Yet if you were to ask him whether he would accompany you, he wandered off, staring at the dog Alex, who waggled his tail and fixed his golden eyes on Talon's talons. The response was obvious. "I'll take care of him and put things right the old-fashioned way." I nodded after swallowing hard. The man's smile expanded. "I think you will," as Alex and Talon jogged beside the bikes getting ready to depart the refuge, his tail wagging with delight. Jesse and the Snake looked at each other, a newfound. The old guy watched them go with a heavy heart, yet there was determination in their eyes. Hopeful, he was aware that they would face challenges on the road ahead, but he also understood that redemption wasn't a simple route. A voyage, step by step, and as they vanished along the gravel path, Alex turned around when his golden eyes met. The sound of the motorcyclist made the elderly guy seem to be bidding farewell to both the sanctuary and the past. As Talon, Jesse, and Snake traveled in quiet, echoing through the deserted countryside, the chrome glinted in the morning sunlight as Alex sat comfortably in the homemade sidecar that was fastened to Talon's bike. None of the three guys talked as they made their way down the curving road away from the landscape, which was painted with a sense of regeneration. However, as the party arrived at a rest area close to the sanctuary, the weight of their common experience was evident. They stopped on the highway, each absorbed in their own thoughts, and Alex leaped out of the sidecar and started to sniff around his tail, wagging it wildly. It was the kind of happiness that only a dog could represent, happiness that was not bound by the intricacies of human regret or hope. Talon sat on the brink of a picnic bench, his eyes averted as he carelessly caressed Alex's fur Jesse. They had leather coats that were worn but strangely less intimidating, and Snakes rested against their bikes. Reached a turning point in their lives, not only on the road, and I don't want to. Jesse broke the pause by saying, I know we have a long way to go, but I don't think I can go back to that life. It doesn't feel right anymore to continue traveling with the team and doing what we used to do. Snake nodded and crossed his arms. Likewise, I used to believe that toughness was the only thing that mattered, but last night He looked at Alex, who was now happily resting at Talon's feet, and his speech drifted off. Last night, he showed me what. It appears that true strength is about sticking up for what you believe in rather than frightening people. Talon listened softly, his mouth clenched as he realized they were correct, yet he was also aware of the consequences of their decisions. Leaving their previous way of life wasn't as easy as getting on their bikes, and the crew wouldn't simply let them ride off into the sunset. They would want answers, and worse, they could seek retribution. Snake remarked in a doubtful tone, What do we even do next? We're not exactly saints, and it's not like humans. Talon stood up, his eyes focused on the horizon, and stated, We begin by owning it. We're going to forget what we've done. He looked at us sternly, saying, We don't run from what we did. We face it and make it right where we can. Down at Alex, who gazed up at him with unflinching faith. And then we stand together with the same resolve as last night. For the first time, Jesse and Snake weren't simply riding for themselves, and something in his voice resonated with them. We're riding with a purpose. And as the three guys mounted their bikes again, the sound of the motors shattered the silence of the morning. But before they left, they saw an automobile arrive at the rest area. It was battered, and a middle-aged guy emerged as the vehicle drew to a stop, its tires churning up dust. His face was flushed with stress and fatigue, and he looked around anxiously before focusing on Alex, the man's dog. Alex stated in a shaky voice, and the three bikers paused in shock at the man's. Talon said, removing his hand that was naturally resting on Alex's head. He questioned carefully, What do you mean that he's yours? The man came gently, his hands raised in a peace sign. Been searching for him for months. He told me that we were in a vehicle accident and that he fled, so I assumed I'd never see him again. He was crouching and extending his hand to Alex, saying, Alex, buddy, it's me. His eyes were watering. After a brief pause, Dad Alex raced at the man, waving his tail. The man buried his face in Alex's fur and embraced the dog angrily. I can't. Talon, Jesse, and Snake. I thought I had lost you forever, he whispered. Observed the reunion and saw their feelings, which were a complex mixture of sorrow and relief. Alex had been there. It seemed like losing a piece of themselves to let go of their buddy, their bulwark in the storm of their own redemption. Yet as Talon moved ahead, he came to the profound realization that he was your family. He spoke slowly and steadily, and he deserves to be with you. With a look of thankfulness and astonishment on his face, the man responded, Thank you, in a gruff voice. Emotionally, I'm not sure what you've been through with him, but I appreciate you protecting him as. The dog turned to Talon as the man put Alex into the car, his golden eyes brimming with something that nearly resembled comprehension. Talon held up a hand in a quiet farewell as he watched the vehicle drive off, returning Alex to. The three riders stood in the dust, their lives belonging to him. Their silence was weighty but not empty, something positive or correct, and even though they were unsure of the path ahead, they knew they had made a beginning move. Jesse asked, breaking the silence, "Are you ready to go towards being the men they wanted to be?" Talon nodded and climbed onto his. As the three motors roared, he said in a resolute tone, "Bike, yeah." In order to return to life, they left the rest area and their former selves behind and turned back onto the highway. As the sun rose higher, it illuminated their way to an uncertain but hopeful future.